everyone, and welcome to this episode of the AWS for Games Boss Level Podcast, where we seek to simplify and demystify how to most effectively use AWS technologies and offerings. My name is Chris Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for video games here at AWS. And on today's program, we have Solutions Architect Henry Kiem. Henry.
Hello.
Hey. Senior Solution Architect Gena Gizzi.
Hi.
Solutions Architect Gabriel Batista.
Oi.
Hello. And Principal Solutions Architect Jon Bartlett.
Hey.
Hey. And on this episode of Boss Level, we are going to be diving into the engine room of modern game development as we unravel how leading studios are leveraging AWS cloud infrastructure to revolutionize their development pipelines. Our expert panel will offer an intimate look at the technology stack that's enabling game studios to work faster and more effectively than ever before, whether they're indie developers or AAA powerhouses. If you've ever wondered how modern games are built in the cloud, this is your chance to peer behind the curtain. But first, as we always do, let's talk about what we've been playing. So Henry, why don't you kick us off here? What are you playing, man?
That's a really good question. I'm playing, well, I've been on a little bit of a board game kick, but that's kind of inspired by the fact that generally I like tabletop simulators. So I recently picked up Age of Mythology again, just to throw it back to my childhood, and that's been very, very fun. Just sort of getting back into that, and I played it a lot growing up, so it's nice to revisit those old memories.
That's right. And nostalgia is an awesome excuse to go back and play those early games. As a retro gamer guy, I completely get it. Excellent pick. All right, moving on. Gena, what are you playing?
Honestly, I haven't been playing as many games lately as I have been reading about the history of game development. Like the first game ever made was kind of Pong. Learning about the Magnavox Odyssey and how pinball machines were illegal because they were a form of gambling. So it's just really interesting to learn about the history of our industry and how we got to where we are today.
Okay, so now you and I are going to have a whole separate podcast for hours about this. So in your learnings there about game history, what was the first video game that you remember that you kind of unearthed? Do you remember the name of that one?
The one that I first played?
No, the one that you found it in looking back at game history. What was the first one done? You said it was kind of a Pong game. What was it?
Yeah, well, so there was a space game that was made by students at MIT on one of the original Macs, one of the original Apple machines. And then there was also at the same time across the world, somebody who made a tennis table Pong game on an oscilloscope. And so those were kind of the first two games that were created, and then Magnavox Odyssey released Pong.
Excellent.
Which Atari then released.
And you got those right. It was William Higginbotham in 1952, I believe, right? On an oscilloscope with one of the machines was used during the Manhattan Project. And it was Tennis for Two. That was the first one. And then it was Space War at MIT with the Model Railroad Club that went ahead and built this thing under the tutelage of Steve Russell, who also won the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Game Developers Conference back in 2012. So, yay for game history. Okay, Everybody else, you all can log off right now. We're good.
Yeah, open
Episode
the can
over.
of worms.
All right, Gena, you and I have a lot more to discuss about that. I'm so happy about that, though.
Oh.
All right, now, Gabriel, go follow that up.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Way to throw me under the bus. I love roguelikes. That is my absolute favorite genre. They just released a fantastic first-person shooter roguelike called Dead Zone Rogue that I've been just completely obsessed with. I'm catching myself sneaking out of bed late at night to go play just one more round.
Oh, love it.
Go try it out. It's great.
Good roguelike because, you're always going back and re-experiencing the level that you were just in because it's a roguelike. So,
It's all about optimizing.
That's which is part of what we're going to talk about today, too, of course. Look at how he stays right on task. That is a professional, ladies and gentlemen. And then we have Mr. Jon Bartlett. Jon, what have you been playing?
I'm currently anxiously awaiting Mario Kart World, which is around the corner. So in the meantime, I don't want to dive into anything big. So I've been going back to some of my old Pokemon games to complete the Pokédexes. So currently on Pokemon Sword. And next up, if I can make it, is Scarlet.
Oh, all right. Very good. Yeah, and I forget just how close it is to the launch of Switch 2 right now. Were you able to get a pre-order?
Yes. So it is going to be arriving very soon.
Oh boy. Yeah. It's like, clear the decks, everybody. It's coming. All right. For my part, I'm still playing through Blueprints. I don't know if you all have been playing it, but what an astonishingly awesome game and gameplay mechanic and convention that's in this. And I kind of describe to people that don't know it. It is almost a deck building roguelike game set in a mansion, and every day you return to the mansion and you're basically laying out the floor plans differently. And I was playing a little bit and I stopped and started back over so I could start taking notes. So it feels a little like work, but a lot like awesomeness. And I'm still playing through it right now. So yeah, Blueprints is on it. And then hopefully, Switch 2. I have a pre-order coming in, so we'll see about all that. But that's what we've been playing. Hope you all are playing a lot of games too. And let's go ahead and jump right into today's subject matter. We're talking about cloud game development. So what I want to do is I want to start first with Gena. From your experience working with game studios, what's driving their shift towards cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, good question, Chris. There are a lot of benefits that we'll talk about for cloud game development that can really help studios, but I think that it's important to take a look at the challenges that game studios are facing today and their motivation towards, shifting to the cloud, right? And all of us here, we work with games customers of different sizes, AAA studios or small indie developers, right? And a lot of the challenges that they are facing are similar. I would say that one of the more common ones that I see time and time again is the shift to distributed teams, right? Especially post-COVID, people just are not sitting in the same building anymore. Even with RTO, return to office, you've got people across the world. You've got artists in Europe, developers in Asia, right? Designers in North America. All of these people need to work together seamlessly in an around the sun fashion to, do what they need to do when it comes to developing their game, right? And I think that a lot of traditional setups just aren't really built for that kind of collaboration. And that's where the cloud can come in. That's one thing. I mean, game assets are a whole other thing, right? Especially with the enhancements that we're seeing with game engines such as Unreal Engine and the demands for games right now. We're seeing a lot of modern games create really amazing open world games, massive games with high fidelity assets and complex animations. And so you really need infrastructure that is built to handle that kind of scale, right? There are a couple of other things that, maybe Gabe or Henry or John can talk about for costs and technical benefits. I'm happy to go into the detail too. But the one thing I want to point out that I'm really passionate about is I personally believe that the cloud is doing its part in democratizing game development. I think it's really great when we can get to a place where we're leveling the playing field for small indie teams or like AAA studios or even me, right? If I want to make a game, right, I have access to all of the same tools that these large companies use to make successful games. And I think that that's really powerful. I would love to see more people making games. So,
yeah, look, I completely agree that we are in the greatest era of democratized information, commoditized technologies, and access to the fastest connectivity in the world, which means that an individual can now reach the communities that they need to learn. They can get access to the tools and technologies to build their games, and they're able to bring them out more effectively to more people than at any other point in not just games industry history, but the ability to communicate an idea to the planet. This is the greatest time to do it. And an individual can make something that completely, spreads virally around the world. Look at Balatro, for example, right? So among that, in the body of that, I should say, are a lot of cloud infrastructure and a lot of, again, distribution technology, security technology, all these things that have to then be in play to ensure that people have that opportunity, right, to, again, find those communities, build in a global fashion, deploy to a global audience. So those are, when we think about the companies that we serve, who wants to jump in and talk about like patterns that we see across multiple game customers, or maybe common like migration triggers or business cases?
Yeah, I'd love to hop in here. I think one of the things that Gena mentioned that's, sort of unique to games, and definitely a common issue. I come over from a more traditional software development background, and when you look at web development or general app development, you don't have these same issues that game studios have around distributed assets, right? They're just sort of these universal tools, the GitHubs, the GitLabs of the world that make collaborating and developing software incredibly easy. And game development has those tools as well, but they've traditionally just been, there's a higher barrier to entry. They're a little bit more difficult to use, and they benefit massively from cloud infrastructure. And so, where traditional software may have in the last 10 to 15 to 20 years continued to optimize, continue to kind of achieve that democratization that you mentioned, games is really only just getting to that point, right? Access to engines is one massive thing. We've seen that already in the last 10 plus years. And it's not like people haven't been building games for longer than that. But as the games get bigger and the tools get easier to use and easier to deploy, we're definitely seeing patterns where people move, the big one being version control, right? That's definitely where most of the studios start. They have these distributed teams, like Gena was talking about. They need to make assets, make source code available to people all over the world. And they've traditionally been running version control on a server sitting in some office or in somebody's garage or under a desk. And you would be amazed at how many people still do that because it gets the job done.
And ask everybody on the team when you've checked it out to manually version it before putting it back in. And all you need is one person to not go ahead and do, a point version properly, and then the breaks cascade, right?
Yeah, there's a non-zero number of games out there that are versioned with, file names like final version 2 for real this time .c, right?
I mean it. Don't be dumb.
Yeah, don't change this, please. Please don't change this, please. So access to versioning software is definitely where we see a lot of studios start their cloud migration, because it's just out of necessity, right? You have people who are now trying to download assets, massive 3D models, entire levels, whatever it might be, from the other side of the world off of a machine that is sitting in somebody's garage. And that's just not feasible. And it's really those types of problems that the cloud is really well suited to solve for.
What I would also add to that too, it's not just about versioning of the code that you're working on that you're basically putting back in the repository, but it's also managing the versions of the applications that your distributed developers are using. And again, all you need to do is be 1 point rev off of something where a mesh breaks, shader versions are different, that can throw an entire team into chaos for days or weeks trying to figure out what exactly happened before you're able to get a handle on this, right?
Yeah. And you have, in game studios, you have teams that are working on completely different projects that need to integrate seamlessly, right? The joke is that it used to just be that you were a front-end developer or back-end developer, and then, there were the people who needed to glue things together, and we happened to call those full stack, right? In games, you have developers that work on engines, you have level designers, you have artists, you have sound engineers, you have playtesters that need access to these assets on a regular basis. And they're kind of all living in this amalgamous cloud pun intended. And so, yeah, just managing access to all of that stuff, especially now in the era of live games where new versions are constantly coming out, you're not just versioning internally, you're versioning externally as well.
Yeah. Who else wants to jump in on this?
I want to jump into this. I think another angle, not to be the pessimist here, we talked a lot about being able to spin things up quickly in the cloud and how we can make it secure. But I think a big piece of these studios moving to the cloud is the ability to shut down all of that infrastructure. I think, more and more every day, the amount of games that are out there and the speed in which players kind of go through games and iterate through games makes it so that if a game is made and it doesn't really hook people in, then you're potentially sitting on millions of dollars worth of infrastructure, of servers. If you're doing things on-prem, the cloud allows you to be able to go big, expand, build the game, build a huge build farm, and then if things don't work out or if the player base isn't what you expected it to be, you're able to just shut things down and kind of scale things back down and lower the cost. And ultimately
I was just gonna say, while you think of your next great idea, obviously, right?
Exactly. And it helps to keep games alive, right? Back in the day, it was all or nothing, right? Either you upkeep this giant data center or you don't. And nowadays, you're able to have a few servers running for the dedicated player base while you're working on your next thing.
Yeah.
And I think just to expand on that a little bit, it's not just shutting down, it's also the agility to change. I mean, tools are evolving, and it's a matter of you don't want to be locked into some piece of hardware or, hardware that's spec'd for a certain piece of software. So in the cloud, you have that ability to shift and change and be agile and really have kind of that modular back end to really pivot and adopt new technology, especially as, innovation continues to accelerate.
So are you seeing this, excellent points all, but are you seeing this kind of take root in the customers that we serve or game developers that we talk to? Are there kind of natural friction points where it's kind of like, we know we need to move to X sort of solution or Y sort of implementation? We'll fix that down the road. But for right now, we're trying to do this. Like, do you find that more developers think about that from the beginning of their development journey, or do you find that sometimes it's like, we now have this big problem, we have to go back and untangle? How do we most effectively do that? Or do you find it to be a mix? What do you think, panel?
It's a mix, yeah. It's definitely a mix.
I will say, though, that I had a conversation with the customer that I work with today, a very large game customer that runs on AWS, about creating automation and tooling to standardize their development environments for their developers so that they have that same environment across the board and also reduce onboarding time. So, I guess they're pretty late in their journey of looking at this because they're already an established studio, but better, I guess sooner is better than never, right? So,
yeah. I also think some of the hesitancy that folks had about moving games or game development workloads to the cloud in general are rooted in a lot of the same maybe misconceptions or standards in games in general. So for example, the classic trope is if you want to be a gamer, you would never buy a Mac, you wouldn't buy a Linux machine, you have to be on Windows, right? And that's certainly still a big part of any of these workloads. I mean, Windows is kind of the premier platform for a lot of PC games at least, but it's certainly not the only target. And
right.
That's one of the really unique things about games. Jon touched on this actually, which is the agility to have different hardware, different operating systems is a massive necessity in games. If you're building for the web, there are a couple of browsers that you have to worry about. I have to make sure my website looks good on Firefox and it looks good on Google Chrome and, maybe Edge or Opera or, insert browser, but it's pretty standard. It's a very well-defined ecosystem so far. But games, you're building for N different consoles, different operating systems for PC, potentially mobile. And so having access to more variety is a big driver for a lot of these studios. They might have initially not been building for mobile, and now they are, and so they have to go get a bunch of new hardware, and rather than do that, they look to the cloud, right? So that's one of the patterns that I see over and over again.
And I think one of the things that makes being a solutions architect so interesting is that you are an advisor for these customers. And sometimes they agree on some of the risks that we see and changes that need to be made. And sometimes we disagree and we see things that maybe they disagree with, so they don't want to make that change. So it's a matter of coming up with contingency plans and recommendations, because it's a matter of they're probably going to hit that pain at some point. And then when that does come up, suddenly that's the spotlight. That's what needs to be fixed. So when that comes to the forefront, you want to be ready. But of course, if they don't want to change it, you're an advisor. So it's a matter of, great, we're working on what you want to work on, just a recommendation. So it's kind of that matter of seeing what they're ready to change or modernize and where maybe they just aren't there yet. So you kind of do that thinking ahead and planning to make sure that you can help them address that as those things come up.
Yeah. And I would say some of this isn't just are not just technological decisions. Some of these are emotional decisions. Some of these are historical bias decisions, right? This is the way I've always done it. This way I've always known to do it. I've got a workflow now that it's so automatic for me that if you change it in any way, now this stuff is going to break. I don't feel like I'm in as much control, right? It's also relinquishing some of that control to services that don't live on-prem. And for some, right, it may take some time. So the important thing is, as you know, if you are working for, a game developer that's been around for a long time that has those things kind of set and firm, and are thinking about how to either modernize your development pipeline or, again, leverage, pools of developers from around the world. It's not about throwing it all into the cloud at once. It's how do you start moving these pieces gradually towards there, building up that confidence, understanding of how to work in those environments that then let you go ahead and bring more and more of it there. And when you're able to go ahead and do that, then a lot of the efficiencies you get out of cloud scalability, like being able to spin down servers and resources that you don't need, being able to go ahead and leverage distributed tools you may not have had access to before. All of that is going to free up more time for you to just focus on making a better game, focus on building more art, focus on bringing in more artists, more musicians, more storytellers, right? To go ahead and build bigger and better. And so, again, it's not about throwing everything out there at once. How do we go ahead and help developers understand how to best leverage the cloud for their particular point in time and for the future in a way that they're comfortable, continue to build their expertise on, and leverage those benefits going forward, right?
Yeah, there's also definitely a level of just being aware about whether it's a particular customer's current setup or what the sort of industry standards are, that not everything needs to move, like you called out, Chris, right? Like sometimes there is a reason to keep that machine under the desk for, who knows what. And we're here to help kind of tie those things together as well and visualize that as well. And I think an equally, kind of big part of being that advisor is taking the fact that we work with some really, really large game studios, some of the biggest studios in the world, and taking some of their best practices or the things that they're honing and evangelizing those beyond just these sort of mega organizations, right? And going to startups, going to smaller customers and saying, hey, these are some really good ideas that you should try out. And this is how some of the bigger industry, the 800-pound gorillas are doing things.
Right.
And believe it or not, actually the flip side as well. Sometimes it's the startups that have these just incredibly neat ideas because they have to be, they have to be frugal, they have to be efficient. They come up with these brilliant solutions to tough problems, and then we get to turn around and go to these, the mega game studios and say, hey, you really should try this, and they validate that. So it's sort of being an intermediary there too.
And
those
are the stories that I love, because that's when you turn some that has this like crazy creative idea, and they're like, oh, that wasn't supposed to work? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
We just tried it and it worked, right? And so, and at a time in this industry where we're seeing independent game development, small teams, distributed teams just absolutely come in with these incredible games and storm the market with them, right? Is really putting up a competitive, kind of environment for our time and our attention for this art against what we had traditionally seen as the way you build video games, quote unquote, right? And so as a continuing flood and more of that content comes in, how do we make sure that they get to do that effectively? So when we're talking about that, what are some of the tools and architectures that game studios can take advantage of by migrating to build systems to the cloud, right? And then how does the cloud solve some common difficulties? I know we've touched on it a little bit, but who wants to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper as we're talking about now the architectural decisions that need to be made?
I can touch on some of that. So, like you said, moving from on-prem to the cloud is definitely a journey. It's not kind of a black and white type of conversation. Many studios start off by moving small workloads, things like their build farm, for example. A lot of the studios that I work with will have a build farm locally in their office, but then they will be able to burst into the cloud, right? So once all of the build machines are full on-prem, then they start to leverage some of the offerings that we have in AWS to be able to expand that build farm. And that journey kind of continues, right? So once you start off with the build farms, and then you move into things like version control, CI/CD, and especially as the studio's teams grow and they start hiring people across the world, I think that's when the pressure really starts to build up to make a bigger move into the cloud. And doing so can be tricky in and of itself, right? Because it's not always just about taking the same workloads that you have on-prem and moving them to the cloud. It's about setting yourself up for success in the future. So we've had some previous episodes where we talked about things like multi-regional deployments, multi-account strategies. Those pieces are very important for game studios, right? Because as they move their architecture up to the cloud, that's their first game. A lot of these studios aren't going to stop at a single game, and they don't want to have to redeploy everything they've done so far manually. And this is where infrastructure as code comes in and plays a big role in this kind of migration. Because when you do it the first time, you want to make sure that you're capturing as much as you can about the deployment of your cloud studio as code. And at that point, you can start to replicate that. You got a new game coming, great. Run this one script and you have yourself version control. You have the CI/CD pipeline. You have your distribution set up. Everything is there and ready to go. And it makes it so much easier for studios to be able to just jump on new ideas and see where it goes, rather than having to have dedicated DevOps engineers sitting around, manually putting together workloads.
Yeah. To keep it really specific as well, I mentioned version control earlier. Sort of the industry standard in games is Perforce, and it's really widely used across the industry. And we'll frequently see studios that run Perforce on premise, and then they're setting up, maybe their first edge or a replica in case, that machine poops the bed and they don't have you can't lose access to your entire game source. That is a tragedy. So what we'll see is they'll set up a replica in AWS, or they'll look to set up an edge in a different region to kind of onboard a studio or developers that happen to be far away from the local office. That's one of the big ones where we'll kind of see the transition start. Then, as Gabe mentioned, sort of the burst to cloud functionality, that's built into a lot of CI/CD tools that are widely used, whether that's TeamCity or Jenkins, or Unreal Engine's new Horde system, which is really widely used in the industry among Unreal developers. A lot of CI/CD tools are sort of purpose built to leverage the cloud. They have native integrations. So those are some of the kind of the key areas where we start to see the migration happen.
Do we see any other common tooling choices that developers are making beyond that? Like apart from just versioning and control, what other things do we see game developers looking towards for again, cloud game development?
I mean, I think there's other aspects in terms of like AWS services that are offering new functionality. So like, for example, we have GameLift Streams, which allows you to stream games. And this is something where some customers are saying, cool, now I don't have to distribute builds anymore. Like no more downloading or sending out my sensitive material out to these testers, I just give them a URL and they can stream that, do the testing. All the assets stay in the cloud. You need to make a change? Great. Update it, push that to your central storage, give them a new URL. So also we're seeing some customers that are making some of these migrations and moving parts or all of their process to leverage some of these new services. And again, that kind of modular aspect of as these things come up, sometimes they solve a problem that you didn't realize there maybe was a solution for. Or, then things like that where, hey, maybe streaming opens up marketing opportunities to just let people stream the game for an hour or whatever. So there's also those aspects that it maybe adds a new feature and then opens up different possibilities for your business.
Yeah.
And also workstations, right? I don't know if we've touched on that, but we have a couple of services at AWS that could help you essentially set up like a development environment or a workstation on the cloud. It could be EC2, like a GPU-based instance, or maybe Amazon AppStream or Workspaces, some sort of environment that you could log into, like a Windows machine or whatever you want to use, so that you don't need to use your own personal work laptop if maybe you don't have the right amount of RAM or resources, right? Or you want to be able to work in that distributed way. So that's also another aspect.
All right.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. Does that mean that am I going to be giving up performance because this workstation is in the cloud? How can I be assured that this is going to work as well as the 50 series graphics card that I have under my desk and an i9 processor? Like, you're telling me I can actually use a workstation in the cloud and be just as effective as having a local machine? What?
It depends on effective, what you mean by effective. Obviously, as a bunch of gamers, right, we can appreciate how nice it is to have an absolute workhorse under the desk that's probably overkill, honestly.
Probably.
Yeah. But that's,
And I say that as somebody who has a probably machine, maybe two.
Right. Yeah. And I can't tell you that you can get a case that has water cooling and cool lights on it for a cloud instance, right? The unfortunate truth is that if you do use a virtual workstation, it's not got all those bells and whistles. But we do have instances that have consumer grade GPUs. And for a lot of tasks, they're more than enough, right? So not every use case, but plenty of use cases, and that same flexibility applies, right?
Sure.
I think Gena was alluding to that too. Like, you can, if you need a machine for a contractor or somebody who's working on one level, it's easy to provide one.
Yeah.
Well, and also as you start moving stuff into the cloud, then it's a matter of, do you want to be downloading assets from the cloud to your beastly physical machine and doing the work and then uploading things?
Yes.
Or do you want a machine that is sitting in the cloud right next to that storage, so all of that data transfer is lightning quick? So it's also a matter of, as you're looking at what parts of your process and your backend systems go in the cloud, that kind of the economics of it change real quick, in that at a certain point of migration into the cloud, it just makes a ton of sense to not be downloading these assets anymore and just using machines that are already there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people tend to forget, right, is that when you're building a video game, you're not dealing with highly optimized assets at the end of the development pipeline. You're dealing with some really messy, overbuilt meshes and geometry that doesn't work or line up correctly. So the assets tend to be, much, much larger than the final work that's output. So to your point, downloading all of that every day, a team coming in and having to go ahead and refresh work that was done by another team that sits remotely overnight could literally take hours out of your day while you're waiting for this to happen. Right?
Yeah.
And that's
a
process.
I think it's also, I agree 100%. I also think it's worth highlighting, though, that, those sorts of dilemmas and problems are sort of right in our wheelhouse as solutions architects. Our job is not to come in and say, pick up your entire life and move it into the cloud. It's what are the things that we think are going to actually make a huge quality of life improvement for you. And sometimes that is VDI for a lot of use cases, virtual desktops. But just as much of a problem worth solving is, we know you have to download all of these assets all the time. How can we improve that? And frequently, we're making recommendations to install proxies or cache servers in local offices, get them as close to your end users. If you happen to have a bunch of developers who are in the same city, there are a lot of levels and layers to sort of the way we propose these architectures. And I think it's really worth highlighting that we can appreciate when maybe there are other solutions outside of just the kind of the core competencies of AWS.
And that's a good point, because AWS works for a lot of things, but it doesn't work for everything, right? An example I can think of is dev kits. If you need to make sure that your game runs on a PS5 or a Switch, for example, I don't really think you can get a PS5 dev kit in the cloud. And so a lot of times what these developers do is they'll have the dev kits in either their home office or business office, and then being able to have an extension of your Amazon network so that you can connect in and still access your Perforce data and your build data is going to be really helpful in those cases.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say, in all seriousness, one of the benefits of actually using a workstation in the cloud as well means that you can then define a common workstation that everybody is developing against. So that way you don't have people that may be out of cycle from a GPU perspective, or different types of mixed architecture. Maybe they have Radeon systems in one place, they have, x86 in another. And so you can be assured that everybody is working from the same platform, much like console development, right? The great thing is that if you are a console developer, you know that every dev kit you have performs exactly the same way. There's no variance. So you're able to go ahead and test in this remote fashion and develop remotely, being assured that everybody is working on the same target. Same exact thing can happen here. And you don't have to worry then about assembling those workstations, shipping them around the world, worrying about breakage, worrying about theft, worrying about upgrade. Like, all of those things kind of go away. And so there are opportunities to go ahead and maximize the efficacy of your development pipeline and minimize those breakpoints that can result in, like we said, days, weeks, or even in some cases months of delay because of those types of issues.
But
the
Chris,
shipping thing is a great
assembly
one.
is the most. I was just going to say assembly is the most fun. Why are you not?
Yeah, listen. When you brought up, the most cutting edge one, I was just reminded that Samsung just released a 500 hertz OLED. Okay, but if you go on Steam, by the way, and you take a look at who's playing, the vast majority of players are playing 1080p 60. Right.
Yeah.
So yes, I love, well, they always say, the old saying, it's always reddest on the cutting edge, right? Or the bleeding edge. Right. Because you're going to just hemorrhage all of this money to get that 500 that, by the way, your eyes can't tell.
Yeah.
And yeah, the one other thing I was going to call out is the shipping that you mentioned is a great point, because there's a lot of AAA studios that are using contractor devs down like in South America. And if you look at insurance on shipping a laptop down there, it's more expensive than the laptop itself.
Yeah.
So then it's kind of a matter of what is the real cost that you're looking at to have these physical machines and ship them all over the place and have contractors have them and then have to send them back. Whereas, the cloud-based systems, it's just a matter of turn it on, then deprovision whenever you're done.
Yeah. Yeah. And John, you brought up a good point before too about using things like GameLift streams for testing. So, when we take a look at, if you take a look at game industry news forever, but really over the past couple of years, and you've seen, a leak has happened with a game build or something like that misrepresents what the game is actually going to be. It's not in its final state, those sorts of things. Asset rips and all those basically disappear. Now, yes, people are always going to sneak a screenshot, right, or a gameplay video off of that. But it's a whole lot easier to deal with discussing that in the public versus code theft. And so by putting it back on the server side, right, you virtually eliminate those types of problems. Then you can watermark for regions. You can do A/B testing. You can do all kinds of things that then become really within the reach of many companies, not just the biggest ones that can afford to, stand up their own infrastructure to do this, right? So again, a lot of really awesome things that can happen when you start thinking about how you can leverage the cloud to solve for development, engagement, testing, and assurances, right, for your dev pipeline and your deployment pipeline as well. Okay, but we're talking about, there's a lot of things that get mixed into here. Gabe, can you talk to us a bit about how, like, in the work that you do, how you're helping studios address not just those growth and distribution challenges, but maybe things like, multi-region architectural patterns that you're seeing, or we talked about cross-region, kind of collaboration solutions. But how, what are some of the patterns, or again, things that we can do to help those studios address those growth and distribution channels? Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that really surprised me working with these customers is when I first joined the games team, I had this idea that these game studios were going to be very protective about their architecture, the strategies that they use to be able to do builds and speed up builds and things of that sort. And it turns out that they're not. All of the studios I've spoken to so far have been very open about sharing how they set up their infrastructure for cloud game development. As a matter of fact, Epic is a fantastic example. If you look at their documentation, they actually tell you exactly how they set up their entire infrastructure. And most of it is actually on AWS, right? So what Henry and I have done is we were working in this space. We had a lot of customers that were coming to us with difficulties, not only deploying their cloud game development workloads for the first time, but also being able to expand on them. So we decided to come together and start to capture some of these common workloads as infrastructure as code, in this case, Terraform. And we released a project called the Cloud Game Development Toolkit that allows us to take all of these learnings that these other studios are sharing with us, capture them as code, and then share them back with smaller studios and give a nice, clean base from which these studios can start from and kind of set them up for expansion in the future, right? Because the way that you set up your workloads in the beginning can either make or break your growth as you start to deploy more workloads and your deployments get more complex. So we wanted to try and address that ahead of time before it becomes spaghetti.
Okay. Awesome.
Another interesting aspect in terms of the kind of multi-region international aspects is even if you are an on-prem company, if you have a latency sensitive game, you can go ahead and burst your game servers into the cloud, and you can have that follow the spikes of player traffic. So wherever there are players playing, wherever it's Saturday night, if that's your peak for a lot of companies, maybe that's where you are just spiking. So if it's Saturday night in Europe, you maybe don't have a data center there, but you can spin up game servers in AWS to cover that traffic, make sure that players are getting the best possible performance. And then, of course, if you are AWS native, that's even easier. But again, you don't even have to be AWS native. You can use that as a burst capability to just supplement what you have in your own data centers.
Yeah, and the development equivalent of that is if you are a distributed company and you have teams that are based in Japan and teams that are based in Western Europe and teams that are based in North America, they are working at different times of the day. Well, you never know. Game developers sometimes are up at 3 o'clock in the morning and they need capacity. I can speak from personal experience.
Yeah, but all of them are getting it at 11 o'clock in the morning their time, that means you're all just out of sync anyway.
And you see that, I mean, all the time. We talk about a build farm, right? If you treat the build farm like a shared resource for the entire studio that lives on-prem somewhere, and you bought, I don't know, 50 heavy machines to serve as your build farm, well, for some stretch of the day, if the studio in Japan is using them and they're located on the West Coast, the latency issues are still there. You have to download that built artifact all the way back across. And what we like to see is actually having the build farm sort of move in waves, kind of like game servers do too. As a studio comes online in the morning, making sure they have capacity for those developers to do builds all day. And then when they're turning their machines off for the night, theoretically, we're doing the same thing in Western Europe, and then the same thing on the East Coast of the United States and North America, and then on the West Coast. So we propose these kind of architectures all the time. And I think another really sort of unique and nascent pattern that we're seeing is as engines become more supportive of cross OS compilation, cross OS builds, being able to build for Windows on Linux or vice versa, right? Building for Linux targets on Windows. And specifically with Unreal Engine, we're seeing a lot more development in this space. That's a huge reason to look at the cloud, because Linux-based instances on AWS are drastically cheaper. We can take advantage of things like spot capacity, which are heavily discounted instances that aren't being used at a particular moment, and we can augment the build farm with those. And we're also seeing a lot of tools that support distributed compilation, right? So rather than running a build job, even if you're Chris and you have an incredibly overpowered machine sitting under your desk that could probably do builds in lightning time, well, if you don't have that, but you want to be able to burst the cloud even from a local build, you can do that too through tools like Unreal Engine's Horde system and the Unreal Build Accelerator, which, to Gabe's point, those are kind of the patterns that we've encapsulated in the Cloud Game Development Toolkit, right? We're trying to take these things, take these open source tools, and make them more publicly available for folks and walk people through using them.
And I think there's another aspect here that we didn't even touch on, which is the analytics side of all of this. There's a ton of metrics and logs being generated as you're building out these games, and that can be difficult to track on-prem and to be able to store on-prem, because you have kind of that physical limit in terms of how much storage space you have available versus the cloud, where you could just expand it infinitely. And I'm seeing a lot of studios starting to create data lakes where they just compile all of this information. They don't really care what it is. They pull it all together, and then they can query through it using some of the tools that we have available and start to gain value from this data that was kind of useless to them when they weren't able to really squeeze out all the value from it.
Well, I mean, you talk about analytics. Let's also talk about some of the key metrics. Like, how would a game studio quantify, right, the success of migration cloud, or leveraging the variety of tools we talked about? Everything from putting your CI/CD pipeline in the cloud to being able to spin up testing servers at night to, virtual workstations. Again, what are some of the things they should be looking at to quantify that, like builds per day or time it takes from game concept to standing up studio infrastructure? Let's talk about those.
I think I can jump in there first. There's definitely a couple of angles, right? And it's something that is really important because it's not just like a checkbox. I moved to the cloud, I'm done, right? You want to make sure that the move and the effort that you put in is actually delivering value to you and your teams, right? And I think taking a step back from looking at specific metrics, right? A good foundation is to set up a solid cloud governance team. These folks are going to be your cloud champions. They are going to keep an eye on your costs, right? Making sure that they set standards for your cloud usage across the company and that everyone's following best practices, right? Basically just like making sure that you are getting the best bang for your buck in the cloud. And if you're interested to learn more about how game studios actually approach setting up cloud governance, I'm pretty sure we did a previous episode on it for Boss Level, but also we released a blog post we can link in the description about how Epic Games set up their cloud governance strategy. So I definitely would recommend starting there, but also you want to measure impact, right? And this is something the cloud governance team can help with. You can look at it from a few different angles, right? Like you track all of the more obvious stuff like build times and success rates, number of builds completed a day, right? But I think that it's also important to look at it from a different angle, right? When developers no longer need to spend time fighting with their tools or their machines, right? And they can actually use that time to focus on building and making games, right? So I guess to give a tangible example, I kind of mentioned it at the beginning a little earlier on about working with companies to standardize and automate their setup for their environment, right? This is something that you can do a before and after comparison. Sometimes, maybe in your case, right, it could take your studio days or weeks to get a developer up and running with their environment and onboarded to your systems, after moving, to the cloud, maybe it reduces that from days to hours. That is an example of something that you could look at to help you measure the impact that the cloud is helping with your game development.
Yeah. So speed and agility, modularity, those are all super important. It just made me think, with GTA 6 being pushed out a year, okay, you got 1 year, you got a 1 year window now. Everybody jump in and start building faster. I'm very interested from an industry news perspective, which, I talk about on a weekly basis on yet another podcast that we do. It'll be really interesting to see how many more announcements come out in between that gap, right? That was just opened up, but yeah, being able to move and pivot really fast and do it without breaking things, super important in this environment today.
Yeah. I think, I mean, all the metrics that Gena mentioned are really key, and kind of tying the two things where on the one hand, you're looking at cloud governance and just what does your spend look like in the cloud? How much are you spending? That is that is so crucial here, because you're shifting expense models, right? When you're buying machines and sticking them in an office or under a desk, sunk cost, right? Now you have this variable expense that can go up, can go down. And so getting a handle on that early on is super important, because I think there's a common misconception that shifting to the cloud is just going to be more expensive, and that's not the case at all. Now, the other interesting sort of connection here is, well, once you start doing that and you have tagging strategies and a mechanism for looking at what costs are associated with what work, you can get very nuanced with, per build costs, right? This build took this long and used this type of hardware, and it was spot instance or it was on demand, and you can get very specific about, okay, well, if we can get our build cost down to a couple dollars, is that worth it? Or even a couple cents, right? Depending on the duration of the build. So that's a really, really, really important practice to kind of nail early on.
And I think something else to call out is that a lot of times customers will just kind of look at the best practices and try and lay out all these things that are the standard. But at the end of the day, there's also, working backwards from what you need. So it's a matter of, where do you see pain? A lot of times you have a gut feel of where maybe things aren't going as well as they should. And so that's where, I strongly recommend you go and you look at what are some key metrics in that area to give us an idea of what's going wrong there, maybe what the trickle-down effects are on the process and or business. And then, as you find solutions for it, then you can measure how much those solutions have improved things and actually see the true ROI. So it's important that you also customize this, because, if you're already operating way under budget, which I know never happens, but let's say that you are, maybe the financials aren't that critical. You still want to have one or two metrics to make sure that if things change, you start burning hot, you see that, but you don't need to spend a bunch of time fine tuning that, because it's not really a concern for you. So that's the other thing to keep in mind as you're kind of looking at what KPIs and metrics to set.
Yeah.
I got one more to throw in there. When you have workloads on-prem, it is up to you, your studio, your DevOps team to manage those servers, make sure everything's up and running, health checks, all that good stuff. When you move to the cloud, you open up the possibility of using managed services, where a lot of that upkeep is taken away from your team. The services already keep themselves alive and do health checks and replace themselves if something goes wrong. And that gives so much time back to your team to actually work on the game itself, rather than being focused on the infrastructure that needs to be there for them to be able to do the thing they care about, which is making good games.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember that cost is not just dollars out the door. Cost is time. Cost is market opportunity. Cost is complexity. Cost is being able to have an environment that allows you to bring in the best, team members to go ahead and build the best possible game. And these are all tips and solutions that you can use to go ahead and help to mitigate those costs, so you're better prepared to go ahead and not only build for today, but build a solid foundation of a game development pipeline that you'll be able to continue to use overall as you move forward. So before we go ahead and wrap up for this episode, what other trends do we kind of see coming right now? Anybody want to lean in with some predictions of what they see happening, some things that developers should be aware of as they consider the cloud for their game development?
Yeah. I mean, I think the hot topic right now everywhere, not just in games, is Gen AI.
What's
So,
that? When you went,
there's some
Gen AI.
What
What is
what
this
now?
thing that you speak of?
And I think a lot of folks are looking at kind of the tactical improvements. But something I think is worth considering that also I find fascinating is the idea of, in addition to using it for back end, it's also something that game developers are looking to build into games, which is going to start giving the players more power to customize their experience. And we're going to start seeing the blurring of lines between developers and players. And I think that's something that developers, especially if you're looking at long-term game development, you need to start thinking more about how you want players to interact with your game, as opposed to just what's the storyline. It's also really like, what are the mechanisms and how do I want people to engage with this content? Of course, that's not immediate, but just for that long term, something to keep in mind. But more short term, I think it's really just that idea of, for established studios, you're finding code assistants or, asset generation that's making processes faster. It's not replacing any people right now. It's not taking jobs, but it's a matter of now your artists can come up with some prototypes and they can choose from those and then refine it. And then also there's the people who are trying to get into the industry where you can kind of build a studio around yourself. Of, if you're an artist, great, you can have AI help with story development or sound engineering or coding. So I think it's also a matter of, you're seeing a lot more competition in the industry as this kind of helps people shore up gaps in their skill sets.
Or
No, good.
expanding on generation of content, also summarization of content, I think is a fantastic use case. A lot of the customers that I speak to are looking for ways to be able to go through all of the feedback that they get from their playtests faster. Because you think about having 100 people on a playtest, each of them records a video that's an hour long and they give some kind of feedback. Somebody needs to sit there and watch 100 hours of video to be able to get that feedback out, right? And some of them could be useless and some of them could be super valuable, and it's up to the person actually watching the videos to understand what is what. And AI is a fantastic way for you to go in, just dump all of the transcripts into the model and have a nice summarization that pulls out where the bugs are, what works, what doesn't work, have all of that in a nice condensed document that somebody can go through really quick and just save a ton of time for the studio.
Anybody else want to lean in on that?
I think the asset generation piece that Jon mentioned is a big one, and again, not for generating the entirety of the art in a game. I don't think, I wouldn't want that, even if it was possible. I like the personal touch, but there is something to be said for, if you're creating trees for a landscape, right? Traditionally, studio will create, I don't know, maybe 20 varieties of a spruce tree, and that will help fill a forest. Maybe 20 might even be a lot, honestly, for some of the lower fidelity games. But now you can create 5 trees by hand and generate 100 varieties of those trees. And I think it's those types of problems that are going to be really massive accelerants. Kind of the same thing. One of our colleagues had this idea for sprite sheet generation. So you're looking at, sort of a 2D sprite from above, right? Well, when that character turns sideways, it's now a completely different piece of art, right?
Right.
And so it'd be really interesting to see, how can we use generative AI for use cases like that, where I design, maybe the profile of a house or a 2D sprite sheet or something like that, and I can, rotate that creature, that character, and see a completely different perspective on it. So, I think those little things, those quality of life improvements are massive. The other one I'll call out is in the latest version of Unreal Engine, I don't actually think it's even released yet, but a tagged branch for 5.6 was dropped a couple days ago as of recording. And one of the things that I saw included in that was kind of a revamp on character creation tools within the engine. And, as we get to a point where there's more flexibility in character creation, I mean, character creation tools have lived in games for a long time. We all remember designing every possible sim that we could, or the variety of Minecraft skins, whatever it might be, right? So
Right.
I think as those tools become more advanced and can start to take advantage of large language models, you'll get even more flexibility in the characters that are created in games.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that we're also, all great points. I think as we're also starting to explore the opportunities around small language models, right, that can be run locally on different machines or on devices that are very highly tuned for very highly specific things. And then you can use several of them and aggregate that output into feeding a large language model, right, that then sits in the cloud, sits where you have that kind of computational strength. It's going to open up some really interesting possibilities for everything from distributed games to games that can happen en masse with, people that are based on environmentals and where they are and what they're doing and the kind of behaviors they have. And so all of these, remember, these are tools to help you, not replace you, right? I remember talking to one studio who said, yeah, we'll use some AI tools to do like terrain mapping and asset creation, everything else. And after that's all worked out, we figured out like what works, what doesn't. All of it kind of gets thrown out. And we say, okay, now we know where to start from. Now we have the blueprint for building our own art, for building our own games. And so they are using it as a way to fast track what works and what doesn't, right? And remember, people are at the center of this stuff. All of these tools, everything, not just AI tools, but all the tools we're talking about, can't tell you if a game is fun. Can't tell you if it's something that people are going to really love. That comes down to you. That comes down to artists. That comes down to us, the people that play. But what we can do is help give you the tools to make sure that you can get that art, that game, that design, those ideas out to the world faster, more complete, working with distributed, global teams for art that you're bringing to the planet. And that's just really extraordinary. And that's the power, really, of cloud game development. And leaning into my colleagues here, brilliant solution architects that sit here at AWS can help you as you explore that journey. And that's going to take us to the end of this episode. I want to thank my co-hosts today, Henry, Gena, Gabriel, and Jon, for joining me. Remember, you can find links to all of the solutions that we talked about, including the Cloud Game Development Toolkit repository and the Cloud Game Development Toolkit documentation in the show notes at the bottom of this posting. But once again, I want to thank you all for joining us today on this episode of Boss Level. We were digging into cloud game development. And make sure you go and tell your friends, check us out and check out the past episodes on our channels on YouTube and other spots where we may be popping up soon. And thanks, gang. Appreciate your time today. See ya.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.